What does it mean to be a Western yogi? How can someone who was born and raised in the West, who comes from a Judeo-Christian background, practice yoga and meditation in an authentic and genuine way? My name is Christopher Sartain, and this is the Western Yoga Podcast. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Western Yoga Podcast. I'm here in South Carolina, in the United States right now, visiting with some family and doing some physical therapy and rest for a neck issue that I've had for almost a year. I have a couple of herniated discs in my neck, so I'm working on healing that. And I might be heading back to Chile in January. It just depends on some different things. But at any rate, I'm enjoying my time here in the southeastern United States, where I'm from originally, and eating a lot of good southern food, soul food, and been getting to play some music with my dad, which is always nice, and visiting with friends and family. At any rate, today we're going to talk about, or continue our exploration of the Gospel of Thomas, and my continuing commentaries on the Gospel of Thomas, relating those teachings to yoga teachings and Buddhist teachings, trying to show the parallels between what Jesus actually taught and the great Enlightenment traditions of the East. And I was just listening or watching a talk given by, let's see this guy's name, Professor Dennis R. MacDonald on a YouTube channel. And he's a very good scholar, first of all, a great academic. I do like a lot of his work. But it's fascinating to see that even so-called open-minded scholars, even some of them have their intellectual blind spots or intellectual stubbornness, and they refuse to look at facts that don't really support their preconceived notions, ideas, hypotheses, biases, and all of that. And he certainly falls into that category. He's not a Christian apologist by any stretch of the imagination, quite the contrary, but he does have trouble stepping outside of sort of mainstream academic thinking and sort of the groupthink that occurs in these religious study departments in the universities. For example, he was saying that he's one of these people that thinks that the Gospel of Thomas was borrowing from the Synoptic Gospels, and that it was written later in response to the Synoptic Gospels. I think this has largely been disproven by Helmut Kester and others in their scholarship. I think it's been proven beyond the shadow of any doubt that the Gospel of Thomas, the sayings there are more primitive, less sophisticated, in other words, than the parallel sayings or the correlates that exist within the Synoptic Gospels, or the four canonical Gospels. I think that's largely been proven. I don't know if he just hasn't looked at that evidence, or he just is in denial, or just closed-minded. I'm not sure, but there are some scholars that just refuse to acknowledge that evidence. And at any rate, and he said that the Gospel of Thomas, at the beginning, it says that it's the secret teachings, or the secret logoi, or whatever, how you pronounce that. And so the secret sayings of Jesus, basically the secret teachings of Jesus, secret words of Jesus. And so that proves that Thomas was aware of public teachings of Jesus, and that so Thomas is attempting to compare these private secret teachings to the public teachings that he already knew about present in the synoptic gospels. But if you look at Mark, one of the synoptic gospels, and especially Mark let me find it here, verses 10 and 14, or 10 and 11, sorry. Yeah. Mark chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. Mark chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. It says, "As soon as Jesus was alone with the 12 and those around him, they asked him about the parable. He replied, 'The mystery of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is expressed in parables.'" Verse 12, "So that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, and ever hearing but never understanding." So in other words, Jesus was telling them, his 12 disciples, his inner circle, I'm giving you the secret teachings. What I teach to the public is different. These are the quality teachings versus the quantity teachings that I've talked about in other podcast episodes. And Yogananda, likewise, followed this sort of teaching style or methodology, and that he had his quality teachings for his inner circle of advanced yogis, advanced disciples, and he had his more public quantity teachings for the masses that were more general and not as detailed and not as occult and mystical. So Jesus saved his true, highest mystical teachings for a few select disciples around him who would understand what he was talking about. For everyone else, he taught in parables, so that, the more common man, so to say, men and women, could understand the teachings. In other words, he had public teachings and private teachings. He had secret teachings and then teachings that he gave to the masses. Now, Mark knew about this. So Mark must have known that Jesus had secret teachings. So in other words, what this professor says is the exact opposite of reality. Just looking at the texts themselves. So in other words, if Mark knew about the secret teachings, and he mentions that there were secret teachings in his gospel, he must have known about a sayings source, probably, the earliest version of Q, perhaps, or the Gospel of Thomas itself may have been extant at the time of the writing of Mark, which is what I've always argued, and that Mark was actually written after the Gospel of Thomas, and that they both probably borrowed from a similar sayings source. And of course, Matthew and Luke certainly must have borrowed from the Q, so-called Q source, which is the earliest source material, written Christian source material that we no longer have access to. We've not found this written material, in other words, but it shows up in the synoptic gospels of Matthew and Luke, but also Mark. So in other words, there were pre-existing written materials that were collections of Jesus' sayings that were used by the synoptic gospels, but also used by Thomas, you see. And actually Mark knew about these secret, private teachings that Jesus gave to his 12 disciples. Therefore, those teachings must have predated Mark. This is just common sense. But again, there are some professors that I highly respect. They're very good scholars, very good academics, but they're so set in their ways that they're just not willing to concede alternative hypotheses or factual evidence found in the text themselves. It's just remarkable, folks. But anyway, I think that these verses in Mark completely disprove, and not only that, but many scholars, Helmut Kester being the primary one, have proven that the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas are a more primitive, less sophisticated version than what you find in Matthew and Luke, meaning that they were earlier, and that Matthew and Luke added a lot onto those sayings and extrapolated things and expounded on things that are not in the Gospel of Thomas, which means that the Gospel of Thomas version of those sayings is more primitive and precedes what you find in the Synoptic Gospels, meaning it is earlier than what we find in the Synoptic texts. This is well understood by people that study these things. But again, you'll find some professors that simply are not willing to look at the facts, and they're very set in their ways. Even if they're more open-minded, objective, good scholars, they still have these intellectual gaps and these intellectual blockages that just will not allow them to see the truth. So at any rate, the Gospel of Thomas was written prior to the Synoptic Gospels. Now, the Gospel of Thomas that we find, the Coptic version that was discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt in the late 1940s, is not the original version of the Gospel of Thomas. The Greek papyri that was found prior to that in Egypt is an earlier version of the Gospel of Thomas, which was a more authentic text representative of what Jesus actually taught. Okay? And so when we look, but it's pretty good. Okay, but it's not perfect. And so you do have to sift through some things in the Gospel of Thomas and weed out what looks like was added later. Okay? And you just have to strip it down bare to the mystical teachings, the mystical sayings of Jesus. Those are the original teachings that Jesus gave his disciples, his most advanced students and followers. Okay? And that's what Jesus actually taught, what he believed. And so we also talk in this podcast about the group known as the Essenes. Please go back and listen to the previous episodes in this Gospel of Thomas series where I discussed the Essenes. But essentially, Jesus and John the Baptist came up in that group, but likely left the group and started their own ministries. We can see that John the Baptist wandered around the wilderness alone. Well, the Essenes didn't do that. They lived in communities. And so probably he had either been asked to leave the Essenes, ostracized in other words, or he had chosen to leave, we don't know. But he went out and he started his own ministry efforts. And Jesus was one of his followers and spent some time learning from John the Baptist. And eventually Jesus began his own ministry efforts that were quite different from John the Baptist. John the Baptist was more of a sort of apocalyptic teacher and talked about the coming kingdom in a physical way. He sort of seemed to think that the kingdom was coming on earth and that there would be God's kingdom would sort of reign supreme on earth. And he was very much sort of trapped in a lot of Jewish beliefs and theology and whatnot, traditional But Jesus broke free from all of that because he was enlightened. He was an enlightened being, a fully enlightened, awakened master, an avatar, if you will. And so his teachings are enlightenment teachings, the same sort of teachings that you find in many Buddhist traditions, yoga traditions, and other enlightenment traditions. It's no different. It's has a lot in common with Zen and Advaita Vedanta because it was non-dual. Jesus was a non-dualist. And we'll look at a couple of those verses today, or at least one of them, where he gives some non-dual teachings. And he was a fully awakened master, but he was part of the Essene group, so was John the Baptist at first, but then they broke off and started their own ministries. I'm reading a great book right now by Upton Clary Ewing, is the author, called The Prophet of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you want to learn more about the Essenes, I highly recommend reading this book. And he goes into great detail about the parallels between what the Essenes taught and then what Jesus later taught. So I won't go into great detail, but essentially the Essenes were vegetarians. They did not eat meat. They practiced a lot of ritual baptism, ritual purification in water. They wore all white. They wore white robes. And most of them practiced celibacy. And they were really into their daily routines and spiritual practices. And they prayed a lot. They spent a lot of time in silence in the desert near the Dead Sea. Okay? And the ruins of one of these communities you can still visit in Qumran, right where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And so a lot of those Dead Sea Scrolls talk about the sons of light, or the children of light. And those scrolls we can directly attribute to at least this group of Essenes. The Essenes, it's important to understand, were not a monolithic group. Okay, some of them had some really far out apocalyptic teachings, which is probably what influenced John the Baptist. And they were really preparing for the end of the world. And the coming of the teacher of righteousness, they called him. Well, that's a bit controversial. Some people think that the teacher of righteousness was someone who actually lived back then with the Essenes, and that he was sort of like the guru of the sect, the spiritual teacher, the leader within the sect, who continually reincarnated in each generation, kind of like the Dalai Lama in Tibet. It's hard to prove these things, but it certainly is possible. And it's possible that Jesus was one of these incarnations of the teacher of righteousness, because there are a lot of parallels to the way that the teacher of righteousness is described and the way Jesus was. And so it's possible that Jesus was, in fact, an incarnation of this teacher of righteousness mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But certainly, those teachings regarding the teacher of righteousness paved the way for Jesus and his followers and his ministry. And he comes out of that whole cultural milieu, as it were. Okay? And so he rises out of the Essene tradition, which again, these people were vegetarians, they wore white robes, they lived out in the desert in the middle of nowhere. They were essentially, they lived in a commune setting, and they shared all of their money and resources. So it was sort of like communism on an extremely small scale. There were only a few thousand Essenes, maybe 10,000, something like that at the most, probably. And again, they lived in different groups. They were not monolithic. Each sect or each community sort of had its own practices and beliefs and things like that. But they were vegetarians. They did not own property. They shared everything. They wore white robes. They prayed an awful lot. They practiced ritual bathing and ritual baptism and all of that, ritual purification. And they were mostly celibate. So they were yogis, essentially, in ancient Judea. Okay? Well, around ancient Galilee, let's say, around the Dead Sea, that area. And especially centered in Qumran, but there were other villages, other communities. Okay? So Jesus comes out of that. This group of vegetarians wearing white robes and practicing ritual baptism and purification and celibacy and all of this. Which is why John the Baptist was a celibate, which was why Jesus was a celibate, because they come out of that context. Okay? So if you really want to understand the real Jesus, you have to understand the Essenes. If you want to understand the Essenes, you need to read some of the Dead Sea Scrolls regarding these sons of light, or children of light as they call themselves, sort of God's elect. Okay? And then also you need to read the Gospel of Thomas to understand what Jesus actually taught before it was, a lot of it was corrupted and changed, and many things were added in the synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and especially in John. Okay? But so much of what Jesus taught was changed, manipulated, for the purposes of trying to prove Jesus's status as the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. Okay? He didn't really care about that stuff. Like, he wasn't really interested in trying to be a Messiah or anything like that. He was just an enlightened soul who was teaching how to become enlightened. But then some of his followers later on, especially followers that never knew him, like Paul, who was sort of a quasi-cult leader of his day, manipulated a lot of Jesus's story and teachings to essentially prove that he was this Messiah figure, Savior figure, and that you had to believe in him to enter the gates of heaven and this sort of thing. But that's not what Jesus taught at all. And then some of his more Jewish followers, because Paul, of course, was really preaching to the Gentiles, non-Jews, in other words. But many of his Jewish followers, more traditional Jewish followers, were manipulating and changing things to make it look as though Jesus was the fulfillment of Jewish prophecies from the Old Testament. Jesus didn't really care much about all that stuff. Okay, so anything that we find in the Synoptic Gospels and in Paul's writings, we have to understand is a corruption of what Jesus taught. The original pure, mystical teachings of Jesus are to be found only in the Gospel of Thomas, as it comes down to us. And again, you even have to sift through a lot of that and filter through some of the stuff in the Gospel of Thomas to figure out what Jesus actually taught, what he was actually teaching. Okay? The first verse I'd like to read today is verse 48. Jesus said, "If two make peace with each other in this one house, they will say to the mountain, 'Move away,' and it will move away." So, in other words, he's talking about non-dualism here. Oneness consciousness. Okay? Divine union, this experience of what is called in the yoga tradition samadhi, divine union. Oneness consciousness. Or yoga. You know, in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, yoga and samadhi are synonyms. And so, that's what he's discussing here. He's talking about the experience of enlightenment, of oneness consciousness, non-dual consciousness, where subject and object vanish, subject and object cease to be, and there's just this experience of oneness. It's an ineffable experience that is impossible to describe with mere words. One must experience this directly to understand it. But essentially, that's what he's talking about here. This experience of the dissolution of subject and object, so that all that is left is oneness. And once that has been experienced, one experiences themselves as everything, and separation ceases to exist. Separation becomes an illusory phenomenon as we realize our oneness with everything, that we are essentially everything. Everything is happening within us, inside of us. And there is no separation, there is no distance. Okay? The next verse, 49, Jesus said, "Blessed are the solitary and elect, for you will find the kingdom, for you are from it, and to it you will return." And so, in the Gospel of Thomas, the kingdom is enlightened consciousness, oneness consciousness, enlightenment. It's not some future destination or a place in the sky. It's not a physical place. It's not even an astral plane. It is simply the experience of enlightenment, enlightened consciousness, oneness consciousness. Knowing what we are, knowing the self, the true self, self-realization, God realization, liberation. Okay? Here he's, in my opinion, referring to this group of Essenes. Blessed are the solitary, meaning living outside of the city, the cities. He's certainly not referring to the Pharisees or the Sadducees, who were the other two Jewish groups at that time, historically speaking, that, lived in the larger towns and cities and everything. He's talking about blessed are the solitary and elect. And again, the sons of light, the children of light, from the Essene scrolls, from the Dead Sea, we find these writings where they refer to themselves as the children of light, or the sons of light, the elect, God's chosen ones, essentially. And so that's what he's talking about here. The Essenes, these groups that were solitary, living out in the middle of nowhere in the desert, and who saw themselves as God's elect, the pure ones, the children of light. And he says, "For you are from it, and to it you will return." In other words, the kingdom, how can we be from it if it's a future destination? So he understands that we're always that. Underneath all of the superficial layers of our being, we are always there in the kingdom. The kingdom is always with us. He says in another verse, it's inside of you and outside of you. But you weren't awake to it yet. You didn't realize it. But it's been there all along. It's always here. We always have access to the kingdom. We're never separated from the kingdom. There was no time when we were not the kingdom, and there will be no time in the future when we cease to be the kingdom. It's always there. Underneath the surface, at the core of our being, the kingdom's always there, always present, always with us. In the following verse, verse 50, Jesus said, "If they say to you, 'Where did you come from?' say to them, we came from the light, the place where the light came into being on its own accord and established itself and became manifest through their image. If they say to you, is it you? Say, we are its children, we are the elect of the living Father. If they ask you, what is the sign of your Father in you? Say to them, it is movement and repose. Oh man, so much to unpack in this verse. But again, he's saying, you came from the light. You are that. You are the light. My spiritual teacher, Roy Eugene Davis, used to say, you came from inner space, and to inner space you will return. And this is essentially that same teaching. We come from the light, to the light we will return. I had an interesting near-death experience one time where I did see this bright white light that other near-death experiencers speak of. I will be talking about that in a future episode where I talk about that near-death experience, two out-of-body experiences, and some astral travel experiences that I've had. But that's what he's referring to here, this light, this pure consciousness that we are, that we always are. Again, we see we are the elect of the living Father. This is hearkening back to those Essene teachings. Okay? What is the sign of your Father in you? Say to them, it is movement and repose. What on earth does he mean by that? Well, it means to be peacefully active and actively peaceful. Yogananda used to talk about that. In other words, vibration, vibratory phenomena, and that which does not vibrate. And the knowledge that we are, at our core, that which does not vibrate, pure consciousness, pure being. Our essence is not vibratory. It's always still, stillness. And so we move through life, once we're awake, with that realization that even as all of this movement and vibration is occurring, in reality, we are ever peaceful, blissful, loving, all-knowing, in the stillness of our essence. And so we can experience these temporary states of stillness and deep meditation where we experience ourselves as pure consciousness. And we can observe from that space and witness all of the vibratory phenomena occurring around us without reaction, without participation, without identification, without judgment, without analyzing anything, with no thoughts, no emotions, no desires. And abide as the self, with a capital S. And so that's what he's describing here. That abidance as the self, which is in repose, which is stillness, and yet moving through the world from that place, existing as the self, the true self, in all of our activities. That is permanent self-realization. So it's possible to experience these temporary states, but it's another stage or level of enlightenment entirely when we're like that all the time, even in our day-to-day activities. And that's really what we're all working towards as spiritual seekers. This permanent self-realization, this permanent stage of awakening whereby we are able to abide as the self in all situations, circumstances, activities. Permanent stage or level of self-knowing. This is what Jesus, this enlightened master, this beautiful avatar, is describing in this verse. And so I'm going to stop there today with verse 50. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Western Yoga Podcast. Please share it with like-minded souls. Lots of love. Namaste.